My fellow Americans, we have heard tonight the President's State of the Union address, what his visions, his plans are, what he asks of Congress and Americans to do. We've also heard the response from the Republican side through Senator Katie Britt. And she went and she focused on what she believed were the failures of our president. She, like many of her conservative colleagues, have attacked the president, not necessarily for what he may or may not have done wrong, but simply because it's her political belief and her ideology, plain and simple. It's a broken ideology. Senator Britt goes to say that Biden's border policies are what attributed to the death of Lincoln Riley. Truth of the matter is, what Miss Katie Britt neglected to say was exactly how these border issues honestly began. The issues at our border are not something that started within the Biden administration, nor did they start in his predecessor's administration before him, or the one before him. The issues with our border have existed for 40 years. 40 years, 4 decades. This is something that the conservatives, like Miss Britt, will never mention. Why? Because it's not in their interest to do so. See, that's the problem when you deal with a party with a broken ideology. They push their beliefs, not realizing that everything that they've done is incomplete. That they did not think out all of the logistics in each and every law they try to pass, or the laws they don't pass. You see, back in 1986, Ronald Reagan signed Immigration and Nationality Act of 1986. Congress was supposed to pass supplemental legislation that Reagan was supposed to sign to offset everything that was going to be done in that immigration package that he signed. Congress backtracked, and they didn't do anything. Needless to say, there were not enough resources to be able to accomplish what was planned in that immigration package. The U.S. immigration system began to suffer backlogs because of this. And what made it worse was that soon after, in one of the following presidential administrations under Bill Clinton, another package was signed. And still there was no supplemental legislation with which to provide the resources to carry it out. This exacerbated that same backlog. It exacerbated it for a long time, even to this day. I can tell you for a fact that some immigration processing times for some applications ran in excess of 20 years because of this backlog. And that's a fact. All because Congress didn't do what they were supposed to do when they were supposed to do it, and then they had the chance back in 1986. So to say, Senator Britt, that Biden's policies are what caused the problem is a misnomer. Ms. Britt is not completely telling Americans the entire truth when she says it's Biden's policies, because the policies that Biden deactivated were not policies that he created. These were policies set in play by previous administrations, and for certain reasons, they needed to be deactivated. Example, Title 42 was instilled by President Donald Trump because of the COVID pandemic. Unfortunately, Title 42 can only be used in a health emergency, and once the emergency was over, it had to be rescinded. There was no legal basis to maintain a health emergency standard when there is no health emergency. Senator Britt did not mention that. Remain in Mexico is another example. Policy engineered and put into play by President Donald Trump. What Senator Britt failed to mention is that that policy was straining the diplomatic relations of our southern neighbor in Mexico. And for that reason, it had to be rescinded. And now, and her colleagues say that all Biden has to do is reverse that change and reactivate Remain in Mexico. But what her colleagues fail to mention is for that to be re-implemented, Mexico has to agree, and they have chosen not to. What all this boils down to is that the problems at the border, they're not the cause of any presidential administration. The party to blame for the issues at the border for the last 40 years is Congress. It's Congress. It's the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. Because they cannot and they are not willing to agree to work together to pass legislation to address the problem. They would rather either find a scapegoat to pin their blame on, or try to place a Band-Aid on the issue by closing the border. They do not want to fully address the entire problem. Why? Because their political ideology will not allow them. It's a broken ideology. It's an ideology that has not been thought out clearly. Another example of their broken ideology is gun violence. How many mass shootings have we had over the last several years? The ideology of the Conservative Party is more guns, less infringement. And instead of that, the more gun, and they've actually passed laws or rescinded laws to make guns easier to be more easily accessible. And did that reduce the amount of mass shootings? No, it did not. And Senator Britt did not mention that. Another broken ideology of the Conservative Party is the taking down of Roe versus Wade and the abortion ban laws that have been passed in several conservative states. These conservative state legislators, when they planned these laws and wrote them out, they did not take into consideration a lot of medical logistics. How can I say that with certainty? Look at all the lawsuits that have emerged. Example, Kate Cox from Texas, Amanda Zawarski, and the other dozen or so women that sued. And that's only the state of Texas, not other states. Also, the state amendments in other states that were passed to ensure that access to the abortion treatments that are necessary for these women who suffer miscarriages. These are laws that were clearly not thought out. Why? In all honesty, these conservative legislators do not have medical experience. And a person with no medical experience should have had no business in passing a law like that without understanding the full consequences of what was going to happen. These are samples. These are clear-cut examples of broken ideology coming from the Conservative Party. In all honesty, and I've said this time and time again, Republicans don't have balls. They don't have the testicles to address these issues. They don't have the gumption to come together and work together with their colleagues across the aisle. In all honesty, they are afraid to. They are chicken. That's the sad reality. Because these elected officials don't have the testicular fortitude to admit they're wrong and do what is right for our country. Senator Britt can go on bad-mouthing, go on talking about the supposed failures of President Biden. But the one thing Senator Britt has neglected to say, and every American in our great country should know this, because it's as clear and plain as the nose on our faces, that a president is only as good as the legislature that supports him. The actions of the president are to sign bills into law, to execute the legislation. But where there is no legislation to sign or to execute, the president is limited. And that is the entire problem our entire country has been dealing with. The fact that the legislature has failed the nation. Congress has failed the nation. Congress should be ashamed. The U.S. Senate should be ashamed. The U.S. House should be ashamed for their inability to be able to work together to improve this country. As Americans, we can only blame them. We can only blame Congress for the failures of this country. It is not proper to blame a presidential administration for the faults of the legislative branch that is supposed to support him, and they stab him in the back. Everything you hear in the news about the political parties, it's always the same. The conservatives attack the Democrats. The Democrats, obviously, they have to point out certain failures of the conservatives because it's plainly obvious that there's a disagreement. But it's easy to tell which side is the side that is more in the wrong. It's the side that wants to argue. It's the side that wants to find the scapegoat and pin the blame on an individual. It's the side that refuses to admit when they are wrong. It is the side that can't even agree within themselves to elect a leader. If anything our Congress has taught us in this past year is that there is more unity on the liberal side than there ever has been on the conservative. And a body that can maintain unity cannot be totally in error. That's the honest truth. That's the truth that Senator Britton should have mentioned instead of criticizing the president. That's the bottom line. It's what frustrates Americans nationwide to see that our country is in the shape it's in because Congress has failed, plain and simple. And I know countless Americans would probably agree that we should challenge our congressional electorate, our representatives and our senators. We should challenge them to work together, to show some testicular fortitude, to show that Republicans do have balls, and admit their mistakes and work together with their counterparts across the aisle. That's the only way this country is going to succeed, is if politicians would work together. The time for hard division is over. It's time that our politicians recapacitate and understand the error of their ways. I would encourage Americans nationwide to voice their concerns with their electorate. Tell them they need to work together for the good of our country. Because it's not going to be enough for them to keep continually fighting against each other. For the conservatives to argue and say these Democrats, these foul Democrats, when in reality the ones that are foul are those with the broken ideology that have passed laws that are incomplete and that don't take into consideration logistics, necessary logistics. If we as Americans don't put a stop to this, more lives will die in mass shootings. More women will risk their lives in miscarriages. Our border will never be addressed. It's time that our Congress finally comes together to do something. To all my elected officials, to the entire Congress, you should be ashamed. You should be very, very ashamed. Because you've put this country into the position that it's in, and you have only yourself to blame. You can't blame the president. You can't blame his cabinet. The fault lies with you and your predecessors for not doing what should have been done years ago. You complain that what the president is doing isn't good, then you need to work together with colleagues and pass legislation to improve upon what the president is wanting. The president can't do anything if there isn't a legislative body to support him. How do you expect the presidential administration to function when you, Congress, the House, the Senate, can't function? You should be very embarrassed, very ashamed for putting our country in the position that it's in. Americans, we need to put our elected officials into accountability. Call them into accountability. The time is now. Only then can we say, God bless America and God bless these United States. This is my response. Good night.